is Caleb Goossen. I'm MOFGA's crop specialist, and today we're going to talk a little bit about weed control in the garden. So for small weeds, or possibly weeds that are just starting to germinate and you're hardly even seeing, you don't need much to disturb them because they're so small and so weak. There are many types of wire weeders. This is actually a homemade one, and if you have a strong enough wire and can bend it yourself, you could make your own, but there are many available for purchase. And being a light tillage implement, they're not going to move much soil. They are going to kill small weeds, but they're not going to be able to take out really large weeds. The added benefit of doing really light tillage is that you're not bringing up new soil with other weed seed in it. And so if you just can come in and scrape the soil surface, disturb those seeds, uproot them, you're either cutting the root or you're exposing it to the sun so it dries out, and that will kill the weed. So you can see this has successfully pulled up some pretty small weeds, probably smaller than you would have thought to pick up while hand weeding, but killing them now means you don't have to kill them later. Another similar light tillage implement, and there are many variations on this theme, but are light tine weeders, where they have a lot of bounce and flexibility. They're, again, not disturbing the soil very much, but the big advantage is that you can put this right over an established bed, and you can go right over a row, and you're going to pull up those small weed seedlings without disturbing the crop. And it can be used between rows as well. So of course, even with our best intentions, weeds can get out of control and get ahead of us. And that's when more aggressive tools are usually called for and will be more helpful. This is a traditional garden hoe, but it is a smaller blade, which is good for getting into tight spots in between different rows. And you can chop out bigger weeds, you can hill next to the crop, hill soil up to it and bury weeds. And that of course will vary crop by crop, whether you're going to want to do that. But this can chop through and bury a lot more than some of the smaller implements. Another more aggressive weeding option and sort of heavier duty is a stirrup hoe, also known as a scuffle hoe or a D hoe. They have many different names, but the idea is that it's a sharp blade on this side and on that side, and it's good for pathways or something where weeds have gotten up a little out of control and you just need to do a lot of damage to the weeds quickly. You can see it works both forwards and backwards, and is particularly good at uprooting weeds. One thing to note, one reason why it's good to learn what weed species you're dealing with if you can, is that this weed is purslane. And you don't have to remember the name purslane, but you do have to remember, if you see this weed, that it's a succulent and it can resprout very readily. So if I were to just leave this on the soil surface and it had a few cool nights, maybe with some fog, or ideally for the weed, if it had some rain, it would reroot almost immediately. One of the things we do to try to prevent that, if you're hand weeding, you can leave things upside down with the roots in the air, but a succulent is really good at holding its own water, and it won't dry out that quickly. It won't die that quickly. It'll want to reroot. So it's best after you've loosened them up and gotten them soil-free, that you can just remove these from the garden and let them die on pavement or in your compost pile or somewhere else. And of course, sometimes our weeds get ahead of us and we have to come in and do a rescue weeding, and that's usually hand weeding. So ideally you will identify your crop, like these carrots here, and do your best to protect those. Try not to uproot them at the same time as you uproot a weed. And then grab your weeds as low down on the plant as you can, because you're trying to remove as much of the plant and as much of its root system as possible. Shake the soil off of the root system, and that will help the weed dry out a little bit faster. And when the weed dries out, that's when it dies. And that's your goal, is to have the weeds dry out and die. One thing you're going to need to consider though is, has that weed lived long enough to flower, and is it starting to produce viable seed? Meaning seed that has fully matured and will germinate in your soil again, either later this year or in future years. So if you are finding viable seed, you're going to want to pull that weed and get it all the way out of the garden, whether that means throwing it into the lawn and letting the lawnmower run over it, or letting them die on the pavement closest to you, or however you want to get rid of them. And it can be a little difficult to know which weeds are producing viable seed or not. It's best to know your weeds to start to learn what species there are. And of course, that's a little daunting, but you can start slow and just think of what is your biggest weed this year and find out what that weed is, identify it, learn its life cycle a little bit, learn when it's producing seeds and how it reproduces. And then next year you can concentrate on a new species and learn that one too. Before long, you'll be an expert. So as you consider weed control in your garden, you're going to want to remember that the earlier you deal with the weeds, the easier they're going to be to deal with. It also means that you can use lighter tillage implements or just less work on your side, and that's going to disturb the soil less, which means you're bringing up less weed seed from the soil, and that's less weeds to deal with in the future. Along those same lines, you're going to want to know a little bit about your weed species, just enough to identify the parts that are going to reproduce and create seed so that you can reduce the weed seed going forward into the future. And that way every year will be less work instead of more work. And hopefully these tips are going to help you have a weed-free garden with a little bit less effort on your part.